May 4th, 1863. 150 years ago, the Battle of Chancellorsville ended. The Battle of 2nd Fredericksburg resolved itself as well. Really, the 150 years anniversary of Chancellorsville ended on May 3rd with the withdrawal of the Union Army from their positions in a salient around Chancellorsville to just north of Chancellorsville. They were still really more or less formed up in a horseshoe position, but the salient was much less pronounced, and the major fighting there ceased after the end of May 3rd. Actually, in the beginning parts of the day, there wasn't much in the way of fighting later in the day, and it was an incredibly bloody day, and the armies were really exhausted. But, that being said, the campaign was not over. Also on the 3rd of May, the Union Corps under General Sedgwick of over 20,000 men, the 6th Corps, had advanced across the Rappahannock River, had driven the Confederates out of Fredericksburg, and were advancing west and north to meet up with the Army of the Potomac near Chancellorsville. Sedgwick's 6th Corps had about 20,000 men. The Confederates on May 3rd were heavily outnumbered, but by May 4th, Robert E. Lee was already dispatching troops to meet up with General Sedgwick's force and engage them. Now, historically, General Hooker continued his withdrawal. He kept his troops in a defensive position and did not attack. It would have been interesting if he had attacked. He still outnumbered Lee, and Lee was already stripping troops to head toward Fredericksburg to guard his rear. Essentially, there were two Union armies, one to Lee's front and one to Lee's rear. The one to his rear was much smaller but was not defeated and was lightly opposed, so Lee had to send heavy reinforcements to face it. In this engagement, it's the second day of the Battle of 2nd Fredericksburg, where Sedgwick is essentially being attacked by Lee. And given that Hooker is no longer doing anything, he's just kind of standing in place, Sedgwick's 20,000 men were a ripe candidate for destruction. Destroying an entire corps of the Union Army of the Potomac could have paid serious dividends in the Battle of Gettysburg, which would have come up later. If the 6th Corps didn't exist, the largest corps in the Union Army, some 16,000 men would have been denied to General Meade at Gettysburg. And the corps which ended up replacing the 5th Corps, I believe it was, and the 3rd Corps on the Union left in the Round Top area for the 3rd day of the battle would not have existed to support them. So it would have been interesting, if you'd still had the exhausted 5th and 3rd Corps when General Longstreet came onto the field, another attack on the flank would have made far more sense. If the Confederates historically had continued attacking on the Union left on July 3rd, they would have run into 16,000 fresh Federals. But if those 16,000 troops were prisoners, they might have just run into some 20,000 exhausted Federals who had already been fought out the day before, and fresh Confederate troops certainly could have played a significant role. The largest Confederate victory during the Civil War in terms of prisoners captured was the Battle of Harper's Ferry before Antietam, where about 12,000 Federals were captured and paroled. Nothing close to that would happen again. That'd probably be similar to Donaldson, Fort Donaldson in Tennessee early in the war. The Confederates lost entire armies several times. The Union, for all their disasters in the East and West, very rarely ever lost any troops in terms of large surrenders. As I said, Harper's Ferry was the one exception, and that was before the Antietam campaign, or during the Antietam campaign. Here, the Confederates are massing a division up against my division, but my division is very spread out, as you can see. The Confederates are really exposing their flank to me as well as to some other parts of the army, but they're focusing their troops on my army, and these regiments are really pretty spread out. I mean, they're not back to back. They're in good terrain. This is very defensible terrain, but they're very spread out. Big chunks of distance between my regiments here, so definitely struggling a bit here because of how spread out I am, and it's going to come back to bite me in this battle. I don't really move early to short my position in this battle, and that really comes back to bite me. But as I was saying, May 4th is an interesting date to me because Sedgwick's corps comes under heavy pressure from General Early's, Anderson, and McLaws divisions. near Salem Church, and they ended up withdrawing over Blank's Ford, I believe it was. They were actually driven out of Fredericksburg and ended up withdrawing across a ford across the Rappahannock River. So the opportunity to destroy over 20,000 Federals was lost. But the other interesting fact is Hooker once again missed another opportunity to be bold, to be like Robert E. Lee, really. On May 2nd, Hooker had the opportunity to attack the Confederates during the day, and if he had attacked the Confederates, only about 13,000 men would have opposed over 40,000 Union troops, while Jackson's corps was marching around the Union Army. It really could have entirely undermined the flank attack by Jackson on May 2nd and could have led to a Union decisive victory, with half Lee's army destroyed and then Hooker being able to turn back on the other half and destroying him in detail. Similarly, on May 3rd, or actually May 4th, Lee had withdrawn. He had driven Hooker back from Chancellorsville, but his army was still in pretty good shape. It was bloody and battle-wearied, but so was Lee. May 3rd was the second bloodiest day of the entire war, and over 8,000 Confederates fell. When you actually look at the casualty numbers of the Battle of Chancellorsville, they're almost identical. The Union lost something like 4,000 or 5,000 men more, but a large percentage of those, about 4,000, were prisoners taken from the 1st or the 11th Corps during Jackson's surprise attack. Take away those prisoners and you look at actual killed and wounded impact on the actual battle, and they're nearly identical. Hooker had withdrawn, and I think it's interesting, his far right, which was also the most removed from any combatant troops, was General Reynolds' corps. To Reynolds' left was General Meade, while the fought-out corps of Sickles, Couch, Howard, and Slocum were all facing the actual Confederate threat. I find it interesting, and I understand it would be incredibly complicated to to maneuver corps, swapping corps out, but having your two largest and most powerful corps separate from the main part of the action, it's just kind of interesting. Hooker probably could have swung Reynolds and Meade around and maybe crushed Lee's flank. Either way, an advance on Lee after it was clear that his troops were headed south to deal with Sedgwick would have potentially destroyed half of Lee's army, while the other half was fighting Sedgwick, and then Hooker could have easily destroyed the other half of Lee's army. So it's interesting. There are always lots of missed opportunities, but Union generals seem to have those a lot during the Civil War. I mentioned too, May 2nd, he could have, attacked half of Lee's army, destroyed it, and then attacked the other half and destroyed it. May 4th, the same thing is true. He could have attacked Lee's army, destroyed the half in front of him, and then moved on to destroy the other half. The Confederates were outnumbered nearly 2-1. Both sides were fought out. There's no reason that they couldn't have been successful in an attack. So it's just kind of another example of, if Robert E. Lee was in command of the Army of the Potomac, if you base his existence or base his command off of the idea of him acting the same way as a Union commander, he certainly would have attacked. Lee wasted no time to split his forces to take advantage of an opportunity. He split his army before the Battle of Antietam. Again, going against all military logic, you generally do not want to split up a superior force, divide it into smaller forces, and present your opponent with the opportunity to destroy it. But Lee would do it numerous times and get away with it. Perhaps because his commander, the commander who he faced, was not aggressive enough or capable enough to deal with it. But Lee got away with breaking several cardinal rules in the military command book time and time again. I also find interesting the Battle of Chancellorsville's parallels to the Battle of the Wilderness, which the two battlefields are less than 4 miles apart, so it's easy to see parallels. But if you actually compare the two, it becomes very interesting. The first day of the Battle of Chancellorsville, there was kind of a meeting engagement. Both sides kind of attacked each other. There wasn't really a whole lot of progress. Not much happened. A lot of feeling out. The second day of the battle was marked with a bold Confederate strike against the Union troops and a bold flanking attack on the Union troops that drove a large percentage of the army but was failed to be followed up on. Real quick, as a side note here, you can see on that one end I was moving around to flank the Union. On this other end, I'm moving around to flank the Confederates. Moving around to flank the Confederates. In this scenario, the Confederates have really broken my right, but the center of the Union lines. But the Confederate flanks are exposed and in serious danger. This part of the video actually reminds me, to be honest, a lot of, if you've ever seen Gettysburg, and General Lee is proposing the Pickett's charge, the attack on the Union center. Initially, he asks Longstreet for his first all three of Longstreet's division. Longstreet protests that if they do that, their flank would be exposed, and you could simply swing around and crush them. That's basically what's happening here. The Confederates have broken my center, but my flanks are swinging around and crushing their flanks since they really overextended themselves. They didn't protect their flanks, and we're kind of moving into their flank right now, and the computer-controlled division on my right is doing the same thing. Meanwhile, both of the computer left and my right have been broken, so the Confederates have broken my center, but we are crushing their flank. Anyway, going back to what I was talking about previously. So going back to what I was talking about earlier, Chancellorsville and Wilderness are very similar, at least to me. As I already said, the first day of the Chancellorsville was more of a meeting engagement with neither side drawing a clear advantage, much as the first day of the Wilderness was. Both sides fought, both sides died a lot, and neither side really gained a clear advantage. The second day was marked by a bold flanking maneuver. General Jackson marched all the way around the Union Army and nearly destroyed it, or at least nearly cut it off from its line of escape. Crushed the Confederate 11th Corps and damaged the Union 12th Corps, I believe it was, that came to its aid. But the attack was not followed up completely. The commander of the corps was badly wounded. The army was thrown into disarray, and the goals of the attack were not fully fulfilled. The same thing happened at the Wilderness on the second day of the battle. Initially, it looked like the Union were making some serious progress, but the Confederates under General Longstreet found a unfinished railroad bed, which allowed them to march around the Union Army with over 4 brigades of troops, smash into the Union flank, and nearly destroy the most powerful Union Corps at the time, the 2nd Corps under General Hancock. Hancock would later say, "You rolled me up like a wet blanket." So another devastating attack, and yet again, as the commanding general of the attack, General Longstreet at the Wilderness, General Jackson at Chancellorsville, as General Longstreet at the Wilderness was trying to scout out the front and plan more follow-on attacks to drive the Union away from their positions and from the river so they could be destroyed in detail. He was wounded by his own troops, who thought he was a Union commander, much in the way that General Jackson was brought down by his troops. Just as occurred after Jackson's death, the confusion which followed on helped to prevent the attacks from being followed up properly. Later on the second day of the Battle of the Wilderness, however, the Confederates launched another attack, this time on the other flank. I believe General Gordon was the Confederate who attacked. And here he almost crushed the other Union flank, so that by the end of the Battle of the Wilderness, both Union flanks had been savaged. Actually, at the Wilderness, the Union had lost something like 7,000 more troops than the Confederates. And in all intents and purposes, the Union had been held in the center, the right had been smashed and nearly destroyed, the left had been smashed and nearly destroyed. So in many ways, the Union Army was in similar shape after the Battle of the Wilderness as they were the Chancellorsville. They were not totally destroyed, but they were pushed back, they were bloodied, and they did feel defeated. The difference between the Wilderness and the Battle of Chancellorsville was that General Grant decided not to retreat, which makes sense. As I already said, at Chancellorsville, Meade and Reynolds, 2 of General Hooker's most powerful corps, were not even engaged. At the Wilderness, a larger percentage of the Union Army was engaged, but the Union Army was still in good enough shape to attack, and was still in good enough shape to move. So while the men expected to retreat, General Grant did not oblige, and he continued advancing, and the rest is history. Had General Hooker attacked on May 4th, things may have been very different at the Battle of Chancellorsville, as I already said. Scourge of War actually does a really good job in that sense. It has over 20 scenarios, I believe, for the Battle of Chancellorsville. A large percentage of those are based on historical actions, but there are some hypothetical scenarios as well. So I may be looking at one of those later where you take over the role of General Meade or the Confederate defenders who had to fight against them. But either way, I think it's clear to say that General Hooker had an opportunity on both May 2nd and May 4th, and he blew the opportunity in both cases. General Grant would not be so forgiving, although he would not catch Lee in a situation where half his army was divided. He would continue advancing. The idea of using the divided army actually should have played a role at the Battle of Second Manassas, or it did. General Lee divided his army into two wings under Jackson and Longstreet, and Jackson held off the Union Army for about a day. Longstreet arrived on the field and attacked right into the Union flank after several attacks on that same day. Much in the way that Longstreet would arrive late on the field at the Battle of the Wilderness, and once again he would smash into the Union flank and nearly destroy it before being wounded, much as General Jackson was just a year before. The two battles were fought nearly at the same time, only about a year separated. Well, a year did separate, but in terms of days and months, they were both fought at the very beginning of May. Wilderness, I believe, May 5th through 7th. Chancellorsville, May 1st through 4th. So very, very close, almost to the year. So that's just kind of a fun little fact. As you can see here, my center was broken, and I am moving forward on the flanks. On the other far side of the map, the AI, which commands the other Union divisions, is also moving in on the flank. But anyway, this battle really, it doesn't end up I don't end up fighting the entire length of the battle because it's clear I'm not going to get a victory per se. Although I definitely think this would qualify as one, as the Confederate division ends up being largely destroyed. But anyway, that's really all I have to say at this point. The Battle of Second Fredericksburg was a Confederate defeat or victory. The Union Army did withdraw as a result of this battle, and eventually the two wings would unite. General Hooker is probably a good example of why you don't want to divide your forces. He nearly got half his army destroyed because one of his corps didn't guard its flank at the Battle of Chancellorsville. If he had 40,000 men in reserve, that probably wouldn't have happened, but because he split his army up the way he did, a large percentage of his troops were not located there. I didn't mention this in the previous video, but General Hooker had ordered General Howard to refuse his flank. He also was waiting on some other reinforcements which had been dispatched from Fredericksburg, General Reynolds' corps, to guard Howard's flank, but that never materialized. He didn't get there soon enough, and it resulted in the decisive defeat, or the decisive surprise. But anyway, that's enough rambling for me on this video. As I said, the Battle of Chancellorsville really ended on May 3rd. This is still part of the Chancellorsville campaign, certainly at least until Sedgwick withdraws across the Rappahannock. General Hooker, commander of the Union Army, would shortly be replaced by General Meade, and the Battle of Gettysburg would result only about 2 months from when the Battle of Chancellorsville occurred. I will be looking at some 150th anniversary stuff for the Battle of Gettysburg when that comes around. So if this is something you're interested in or have liked, I really do appreciate the support as it stands. This is the Historical Gamer. I really enjoy commenting and interacting with you guys, so feel free to leave comments. I try to respond to all of them that I have any kind of clue. If you're going to ask me about technical support for some of these games that I cover, I may not be able to give you a whole lot of help, but as I said, I really enjoy interacting with you guys, so please feel free to leave a comment, leave likes, as I just said, and really, this is it. Until the next time, this is the Historical Gamer, signing off.